The message popped up on my phone while I was arranging a bouquet of ivory roses for a client's wedding in downtown Boston. Hey Claire, so, the venue's overbooked. There's no room for you on the guest list. Sorry, just like that one casual text from my sister Anna erased me from her wedding. No explanation, no apology, just sorry. I stared at the screen surrounded by flowers that suddenly smelled like betrayal. 6 months of work. 6 months of my heart poured into every detail of her dream wedding, and I was out. A single text as if she were canceling lunch, not cutting me out of one of the most important days of her life. I stood frozen, my hands trembling slightly as petals slipped between my fingers and landed softly on the marble counter. Outside the studio windows, snow flurries drifted lazily through the Boston winter air, but inside the world felt still. My chest tightened with disbelief. This had to be a joke. Anna loved drama, sure, but she wouldn't actually uninvite me. Not after everything I'd done. I read the message again, the words blurring at the edges. There's no room for you. Not we wish you could be there. Not we'll figure something out. Just no room. My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 30 years old, the owner of Amour Events, a boutique wedding planning company that turns chaos into beauty. My clients joke that I'm part therapist, part magician. I make everything flawless down to the last petal. That's what I love most, the moment a bride walks into her reception and bursts into tears of joy because everything is perfect. That's my high, that's my pride. Anna and I grew up in the same old Victorian house in Providence. She was always the golden one, cheer captain straight. A student, the girl every teacher adored. I was the quiet one, the one who made sure things worked, who cheered from the sidelines while she shone. She was always the star, I was the stagehand. Still, I loved her. I really did. When she got engaged last summer to her college sweetheart Dylan, I was genuinely thrilled. I offered to plan everything as my gift. Everything on me, sis, I told her, wrapping her in a hug while she squealed with excitement. Your dream wedding, completely free. For months I'd lived and breathed that wedding. I found the perfect coastal venue on Marblehead Bay, the kind of place where the sun kissed the water just as the ceremony would begin. I booked the best vendors in New England, Cortini's Catering, Fleur de Lis Florals, the Seaside Quartet. I used every favor, every connection I had. All for Anna, all for family, and now I wasn't even invited. The disbelief burned into something hotter, sharper. I grabbed my phone and hit call. The first ring went unanswered. The second. By the third, I was pacing the studio floor, my breath uneven. Finally, voicemail. Anna, what's going on? Your message, please tell me that was a mistake. I hung up before my voice cracked. Seconds later, another vibration, this time from Mom. Relief surged until I read her words. Sweetheart, don't be upset. Derek's family is huge. They had to cut down the guest list. It's nothing personal. Nothing personal. My throat tightened. I called her immediately. Mom, did you see Anna's text? Yes, honey, I did. Try not to take it so hard. Not take it so hard, I felt my voice rising. I've worked on this for 6 months, for free. Thousands of dollars in deposits. Hours of my life, Mom. That was your choice to make it a gift. She interrupted, her tone already sharpening. You can't hold a gift over someone's head, Claire. This is Anna's special day. Her special day. My voice broke into a laugh that wasn't really laughter. I'm not even invited to it. A pause, then the familiar sigh I'd known since childhood, the one that meant I was once again the difficult one. Claire, don't make this about you. The line went dead. I stood there in my studio phone, still pressed to my ear, the faint buzz of the disconnected call filling the silence. My reflection in the shop's window looked foreign, eyes too bright, mouth too tight. I wanted to scream, to break something, but instead I just stood still, surrounded by half-assembled centerpieces and the scent of eucalyptus. That night I tried to work, but my focus dissolved. Every ribbon I tied, every flower I placed felt hollow. At midnight I poured a glass of wine and stared at my laptop screen, scrolling through the contracts for Anna's wedding. The list of vendors glowed in neat columns: venue caterer, florist, linen, string quartet. Each line bore my signature. When Dad called the next morning, I hoped stupidly that maybe he'd take my side. "Hey, Pumpkin," he said in that cheerful tone that never meant good news. "Listen, the family's chipping in for Anna and Dylan's wedding gift, a little something to help them with their new condo. Your share's $2,000. You can just Venmo it to me." I closed my eyes. "Dad, I'm not invited to the wedding." "This isn't about that," he said quickly, the warmth in his voice thinning. "This is about family. Don't be petty over a seating arrangement." I felt my pulse spike. "Dad, this isn't about a seat. It's about respect." "Claire," he snapped, "don't punish your sister because you're jealous. You've got your own life, your own business. Let her have her moment." Jealous. The word sliced through me. I didn't even respond. I just ended the call. When the silence returned, I realized my hands were shaking. My family, my own family, had erased me, then expected me to keep paying for their picture-perfect fantasy. The hurt hardened into something I hadn't felt in years: resolve. By evening, I was back at my studio, the city outside turning gold under the winter sunset. My assistant had gone home, leaving me alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustle of petals in their buckets. I opened the laptop again. The contracts sat neatly in their folder: Amor Events Client, Anna Donovan. Except as my eyes trailed down the page, I noticed a detail I'd never paid much attention to before. At the top in bold type, it read, "Contract holder, Amor Events LLC. Claire Donovan, CEO." Every signature line, every payment term, every clause, all under my company's name. A slow, strange calm washed over me. My heart steadied, my mind clearing like the sky after a storm. I took a sip of the wine beside me and whispered into the quiet, "Maybe this time they'll finally see what I'm worth." The snow outside fell thicker, coating the city in silence. My phone buzzed again, another message from Anna flashing across the screen. I didn't open it. I didn't have to. For the first time in years, I didn't feel desperate for her approval. I felt something else entirely: power. I closed my laptop, the glow fading to black. The reflection staring back at me in the screen wasn't the invisible sister anymore. Not the overlooked daughter. It was a woman who had just remembered exactly who she was and what she controlled. The morning after the dinner at my parents' house, I woke up to a strange, hollow quiet. The kind that fills every corner when you realize no one's going to call, no one's going to explain. My phone lay face down on the nightstand, a dark rectangle of silence. I rolled over, blinking against the sunlight pouring through my blinds. For a moment I thought maybe it had all been a nightmare. Then I saw the unopened text at the top of my screen, Anna's name, the same short message. "No room for you." It hadn't changed overnight. Neither had she. I brewed a cup of coffee and tried to lose myself in work. But every time I opened my email there, it was another reminder of the wedding I wasn't invited to. Vendors asking for final details. Musicians confirming rehearsal times. Each message had my company's name in the header: Amor Events. My company, my work, my fingerprints on a celebration that I was now forbidden to attend. I kept replying politely, keeping it professional the way I always did. "Thank you for your update. Proceed as planned." But inside each reply chipped away at the small pieces of dignity I had left. When I finally opened Instagram, the pain turned sharp. The first post that appeared on my feed stopped me cold. "Countdown to Forever," the caption read. Anna and Dylan stood on the steps of a conservatory I had recommended months earlier, smiling, champagne glasses raised. My floral design, my signature cascading greenery and white roses, framed the photo perfectly. My design, her glory. Scrolling further only made it worse. There were dozens of photos from the bridal shower, all tagged with number bride goals and number forever with Dylan. The caption that cut deepest came from Anna herself. "Couldn't have done it without my amazing team. I handled most of the details myself." My throat tightened. She didn't just erase me, she'd replaced me. The comments poured in. "You're so talented. Everything looks perfect. "You should do this for a living," and she responded to each one like the gracious host she'd never been. I set my phone down, pressing both palms against the counter. "She took my work," I whispered. "She took everything." I thought about calling my mother, but what was left to say? She would defend Anna the same way she always did. My parents had turned favoritism into an art form. It started small: Anna getting the last cookie, Anna getting the bigger bedroom. Anna's mistakes brushed away like dust. I was the steady one, the strong one, the helper who didn't need attention. Mom's favorite phrase echoed in my head, words I'd heard since I was 10: "Claire doesn't need help. She's our rock." It sounded noble back then. Now it felt like a sentence. Rocks don't feel. Rocks just sit there holding up everything else while being stepped on. I remembered the day Anna crashed Mom's car in high school. I had taken the blame, convinced that being the good daughter was my role. When I left for college, they paid her tuition, but told me I was independent enough to handle my own. I waited tables, worked late nights, paid off loans, and built my company from scratch. And still, somehow, I was the disappointment. The one who didn't marry, didn't settle down, didn't fit the mold of their perfect family photo. It wasn't just the wedding. It was years of invisible sacrifices coming full circle in one text message. By the time I met Gianna for lunch that afternoon, I was shaking not from anger but from exhaustion. The little Italian cafe on Beacon Hill smelled like roasted garlic and rain-soaked stone. Gianna was already there, tapping her pen against a notepad, the way she always did when something was on her mind. She was one of the few people I trusted, the kind of friend who could cut through my walls without asking for permission. "You look like someone's ghost," she said, sliding me a glass of wine before I could speak. "My sister uninvited me from her wedding," I said flatly. Gianna blinked. "What?" She texted me. Said there's no room left. "Claire, you planned the wedding." "I know." She leaned forward. "And your parents?" "They told me not to take it personally." Gianna's eyes darkened. "That's emotional abuse. You realize that, right?" I laughed bitterly. "No, it's just Tuesday in the Donovan household." She shook her head. "You've spent your whole life letting them treat you like an assistant who happens to share their last name. You run a company, Claire. You're not powerless." I looked down at my hands, at the faint scratches from arranging flowers earlier that morning. "I don't feel powerful." Gianna reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Then borrow mine for a while. But I promise you this, you have leverage. You just haven't used it yet." Her words stayed with me long after we said goodbye. As the sun dipped behind the brick buildings, I drove to Providence to see my parents, the city lights blurring past like streaks of gold and silver. The road felt longer than usual, the kind of drive that tightens your chest with every mile. I told myself I wasn't going there to fight, I just needed closure. When I arrived, laughter spilled from the dining room window before I even knocked. Through the glass, I saw Anna sitting at the table in a white sweater, wine glass in hand, surrounded by our parents and Dylan. Her laugh was bright, carefree, the kind of sound that used to make me proud before it started to sting. I took a deep breath and walked in. The conversation stopped like someone had hit a switch. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward me. "Claire," my mother said slowly, "we weren't expecting you." "I can tell," I replied, glancing at the full table. "I thought we could talk." Anna leaned back, smirking slightly. "Now's not really a good time. We're having dinner. I'll wait." My father sighed, setting down his fork. "Claire, please don't start anything. Your sister's under enough stress." "I'm not starting anything," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just want to understand. You asked me to plan your wedding, Anna. You let me invest months of my life, and then you uninvited me with a text." She shrugged. "Dylan's family's flying in from Florida. We had to make cuts." "You cut me," I said quietly. "Your own sister. Don't be dramatic. You're still handling the flowers and the layout, right? It's not like you're not involved." I blinked at her. "You expect me to keep working on a wedding I can't attend?" She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "It's business, Claire. Keep it professional." The way she said it, calm, dismissive, was worse than yelling. My mother reached across the table, patting Anna's hand like she was a child who'd just done something brave. She's right, honey. Don't mix emotions with work. It's not healthy. Something inside me cracked. For years, I'd mistaken silence for peace, obedience for love. But sitting there watching them defend her cruelty, I realized silence was just the language of the powerless. And I wasn't powerless anymore. I stood up. You know what, you're right. It's business. My mother frowned. Claire, no, I said, cutting her off gently. I understand now. Anna smirked, probably assuming I'd back down as always. But this time I didn't. I walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at her. You should be careful with business, Anna. It has terms. And consequences. Her smile faltered for the first time. The drive back to Boston was quiet. Snow had started falling thick and slow, turning the highway into a blur of white. I didn't cry this time. I just felt hollow and strangely calm. The girl who always apologized, who always fixed everything, had vanished somewhere between Providence and the city skyline. When I reached my apartment, I sat on the couch and stared at the stack of files on my desk, contracts, invoices, checklists. My entire career built on structure and fairness, on making chaos beautiful. I poured a glass of wine and opened my laptop. The glow illuminated the words that now felt like an invitation from Fate Contract Holder Amore Events LLC. Claire Donovan. I traced my name with my fingertip, reading it slowly, deliberately, as if seeing it for the first time. Every vendor, every signature, every obligation tied to me. A slow realization spread through me like heat after a long winter. All these years they'd used my kindness because they assumed I'd never use my power. They were wrong. I leaned back, letting the city lights flicker across my window. My reflection stared back, eyes steady, no tears this time. I whispered to myself, I've spent my whole life fixing their messes. Maybe it's time to let them see what happens when I stop. Snow flurries drifted past the window as I sat at my kitchen table, the contract folder still open beside my untouched breakfast. My hands rested on the papers as if they were sacred relics, proof that maybe for once life had given me a tool instead of a test. I had leverage now, but power without direction can be dangerous, and I didn't want to become the kind of person who hurt others out of pain. I wanted clarity, not revenge. Or maybe I wanted both and was too proud to admit it. My phone buzzed across the table, Ethan calling. I answered on the third ring. You didn't sleep, he said immediately, his voice still warm from sleep. I'm fine, I lied. Don't tell me that. I can hear you thinking from here. I smiled, faintly imagining him still tangled in the sheet's hair, a mess, eyes half open. It's not thinking, I said softly. It's sorting. Sorting what? The difference between justice and vengeance. He was quiet for a moment. Do I need to be worried? No, I said. But they might. He sighed the way only someone who truly loves you can, equal parts admiration and concern. Come to dinner tonight. I'm making risotto. You can bring the contracts if you want to talk through them. I might, I said. You'll bring them, he replied. You always bring your work. He wasn't wrong. That evening I arrived at his apartment, overlooking the harbor, the city lights flickering against the water like fireflies. The smell of garlic and butter wrapped around me as soon as I stepped inside. Ethan poured me a glass of wine and gestured toward the table where he'd already set out 2 plates. You're trying too hard, I teased. I'm trying exactly hard enough, he said. Now sit. Tell me why those papers haven't left your hands since last night. I took a sip of wine and placed the folder between us. These contracts, they're all under my company. Every vendor, every deposit. If the final payments aren't made by next week, they're void. He raised an eyebrow. And you're wondering what happens if you don't remind them? I met his gaze. Or if I do remind them, professionally. He nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind the question. That's not petty, Claire. That's procedure. Gianna said the same thing, I murmured. Ethan looked at me carefully. You talked to her this morning. I needed to know I wasn't crazy. And she said I hold all the cards. Her words, not mine. He leaned back thoughtful. You've spent your whole life letting people use you because you didn't want to be called difficult. Maybe it's time to be difficult. I laughed softly. You make it sound easy. He reached across the table, taking my hand. It won't be easy, but it'll be worth it. Later that night after dinner, we sat by the window watching the snow fall into the dark water. Ethan handed me a travel brochure from his briefcase, images of sunlit piazzas, the Amalfi Coast gondolas gliding through narrow canals. What's this? I asked. An escape plan, he said simply. My company's opening an office in Florence. I'm going next month. You should come with me. 10 days in Italy, no weddings, no family, no drama. I smiled faintly. You're serious? As serious as I am about us, he said, his eyes steady. You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. You deserve a life that's bigger than their chaos. That line stayed with me long after I left. Bigger than their chaos. I wanted that. I wanted peace that didn't feel like compromise. The next morning, I called Gianna and asked if we could meet. She suggested her office near the financial district. When I arrived, she was already flipping through one of the contracts, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose. Claire, she said without looking up, this is not a mess. This is order disguised as disaster. I sat across from her, watching her pen dance across the margins of the document. Everything's in your name, she continued. Venue, catering, florals, every single one lists Amore Events as the contracting party. You're fully protected. Protected, how Gianna smiled. If they don't pay the final balances, you have the legal right to cancel. Vendors can't contact Anna directly without breaching contract. You hold the keys to the entire wedding. The words settled like calm water after a storm. So technically, I could pull everything. Technically, she said, closing the folder, you could. But I suggest you stay professional. Send reminders. Keep everything documented. If they miss the deadlines, let the contracts expire. It's business, not revenge. I don't want revenge, I said quietly. Gianna looked up at me, her expression gentle but knowing. You do, you just want it clean. She was right. I spent the next afternoon in my studio, surrounded by color-coded folders and vendor invoices. It felt almost meditative, lining everything up, labeling each document, reading through every clause I had once written, in a haze of ambition and caution. Back then, I'd thought these papers were just boring formalities. Now I saw them for what they were: armor. My laptop pinged with new notifications as I drafted 4 polite reminder emails. Each one began the same way. Dear vendor, this is a courtesy reminder that the final balance for the Donovan Hughes wedding is due on date. Failure to remit payment by the stated deadline will result in automatic cancellation as per Section 7.1 of our agreement. The tone was calm, professional, almost cold. I attached each contract section with the relevant clause highlighted. It wasn't anger, it was order. And order was power. When I finished, I sat back and stared at the screen. The cursor blinked steady as a heartbeat. Ethan's words came back to me, bigger than their chaos. I hit schedule send for 9:00 a.m. the following morning. That night, I treated myself to dinner at a small bistro across the street. For the first time in weeks, I ate slowly without checking my phone every 5 minutes. I watched couples walk by the frosted windows, snowflakes catching in their hair. Somewhere deep inside, I realized I didn't envy them. I pitied anyone still trapped in someone else's approval. Back home, I poured a glass of wine and opened my laptop again. The contracts glowed softly in the lamplight. I opened one document, the floral agreement, and reread my own terms. All designs and intellectual property remain the exclusive ownership of Amore Events until final payment is received. I smiled to myself. Anna could copy my work all she wanted, but she couldn't own it. Not legally, not spiritually. As midnight approached, my phone lit up with a call from my mother. I let it ring out once, twice, then hit decline. A text arrived seconds later. Please don't make things harder for your sister. She's under a lot of pressure. I typed a response, then deleted it. Instead, I whispered to the empty room, I'm not making things harder. I'm just done making them easier. The following morning, my scheduled emails deployed automatically at exactly 9 o'clock. I was in the middle of arranging peonies for another client when my phone buzzed with out-of-office replies and confirmations. The process had begun. By noon, Gianna called. You did it, didn't you? She said, without preamble. Just business, I replied. She laughed. You're learning. When I hung up, I realized I wasn't anxious anymore. For once, I wasn't waiting for validation or permission. The silence didn't hurt. It felt like peace. That evening, Ethan came by with takeout and 2 plane tickets tucked in his jacket pocket. For Italy, he said, handing them to me. No pressure, but I thought you might want to celebrate the end of an era. I traced my finger over the date 2 weeks from today. That's the weekend of Anna's wedding, I murmured. I know, he said. I looked up at him. You planned this on purpose. Call it poetic timing. I laughed, shaking my head. You're dangerous. He kissed my forehead. Only when I'm right. After he left, I stood by the window watching the city lights blur into gold and silver streaks on the glass. I imagined Anna rehearsing her perfect smiles, my mother fussing over table placements, my father pretending not to notice the imbalance that had defined our family forever. None of them realized how fragile their illusion was, how easily one missing payment could unravel everything. I turned off my phone, leaving their world outside the quiet bubble of my apartment. My hands no longer shook. My heart no longer raced. In the silence, I could almost hear the faint tick of an invisible clock counting down. Not to their downfall, but to my freedom. The first snow of December had settled like powdered sugar over the city when I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. At first, I thought it might be Ethan or one of my vendors checking in. But when I reached for it and saw the flood of Instagram notifications, my stomach tightened. Anna had posted again. I told myself not to look. I told myself that checking would only reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. But human nature is cruel that way. Curiosity and pain often share the same pulse. I unlocked my phone, and there it was, a carousel of perfect glossy photos from her bridal shower. The first image nearly stopped my breath. The caption read, "The countdown begins," with heart emojis and champagne flutes. Anna stood at the center of it all, laughing, her hair curled into effortless waves, surrounded by bridesmaids in soft blush pink dresses. The setting was unmistakable, the Glass House Conservatory, my venue. The one I'd researched, toured, and recommended months earlier. And those flowers, white roses twined with eucalyptus, cascading along the table edges, they were my design. Every petal, every arrangement mirrored my signature style. I scrolled further. The comments were glowing. It looks like a dream. You're so talented, Anna. Did you do this yourself? And then under one of them, Anna had replied, Yes, I handled most of the details myself. The world went silent around me. The hum of the heater, the ticking clock, everything faded. I stared at her words until they blurred. It wasn't just that she'd taken credit for my work. It was that she'd done it so publicly, so effortlessly, as if erasing me had always been part of her plan. I set the phone down and walked to the window, watching the flakes swirl outside. Boston looked calm, timeless, like a city painted in stillness. Inside, though, something inside me cracked open, the quiet kind of pain that doesn't explode but expands, a hollow ache spreading through every nerve. Later that morning, Ethan came by with coffee. He took one look at my face and frowned. What happened? I handed him my phone wordlessly. He scrolled, his jaw tightening with each swipe. She didn't even tag you, he said finally. Of course she didn't. She used your designs, your layout, your everything. I finished. She used everything. He set the phone down gently, his voice low. You don't have to keep letting them do this to you. I'm not planning to, I said, surprising both of us. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. Good, because what they're doing isn't family drama anymore, Claire. It's theft, emotional and literal. I almost laughed. "You sound like Gianna." "She's right," he said, "and you know it." I sipped the coffee, staring out the window. The snow was falling harder now, cloaking the city in quiet. "I just don't understand how people can hurt you and still expect you to love them for it." "Because they think love means surrender," Ethan said softly. "But it doesn't." We sat in silence for a while, and for once I didn't fill it with apologies or excuses. The silence felt good. It felt like air. By noon, I was back at my studio going through emails. The subject line that caught my attention came from Bloom and Vine Floral's final mock-up confirmation for Anna Donovan. My breath stilled. I clicked open the message. "Hi, Claire," it began cheerfully. "Anna just wanted to confirm her final changes for the Donovan Hughes wedding floral design. Everything looks wonderful. She has a great eye." My pulse jumped. Great eye. The designs she'd approved were mine, my sketches, my samples, my artistry. I typed back, fingers steady. "Please proceed with the original specifications as outlined in the signed contract. No further changes authorized. Claire Donovan Amour Events." When I hit send, something inside me clicked into place. Not anger control, a slow, deliberate calm. For years, I'd been the family's invisible scaffolding, the one who held everyone up while they built their perfect facade. But scaffolding doesn't stay forever. Eventually, it's taken down, leaving the structure to stand or collapse on its own. That evening, I printed every wedding contract and spread them across my desk. The pages formed a mosaic of my work, my rules, my boundaries. Every signature belonged to me. Every clause was my protection. As I worked, a strange peace settled over me. The part of me that once wanted to scream, to beg for acknowledgement, had gone quiet. In its place was something stronger, colder, cleaner. I no longer needed their approval to feel valid. What I needed was my dignity back. I spent hours highlighting clauses, reviewing dates, color-coding deadlines. My hand barely trembled. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their chaos. I was orchestrating my own order. At midnight, I stepped away from my desk and looked around the studio. The vases, the ribbons, the candles, all reminders of how much beauty I'd built out of other people's messes. And yet the thing I'd never created for myself was freedom. I turned off the lights and headed to the Charles River. The cold air bit my cheeks as I leaned against the railing, watching the current move beneath the bridge. I pulled a small bundle of white rose petals from my coat pocket, remnants from a sample arrangement earlier that day, and tossed them into the dark water. They floated away, slowly catching the glow of street lamps like tiny lanterns. "Goodbye," I whispered, not to Anna, not to my parents, but to the version of myself that had always been waiting for permission to be enough. The next morning, my inbox was already full. Clients, vendors, updates. But one message stood out, blinking at the top: payment reminder. Final balance due, Anna Donovan wedding. The due date glared at me, 3 weeks away. My lips curved into a small, deliberate smile. I clicked the remind me later option, then closed my laptop. The hum of the city outside rose like distant applause, subtle and satisfying. Later that afternoon, Ethan stopped by with lunch. I handed him a sandwich and a smile that he studied suspiciously. "You're too calm," he said. "That's either a good sign or a terrifying one. Maybe both." He leaned on the counter. "You've decided something, haven't you?" I nodded. "I'm done rescuing people who keep setting fires." He laughed softly. "That's poetic. It's overdue." We ate quietly, sunlight pouring through the windows. I could almost feel the shift in the air, the difference between waiting for disaster and preparing for transformation. When Ethan left, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window. Snow had started falling again, heavier this time, coating the streets below in white. My reflection in the glass looked different, still me, but sharper, clearer. I picked up my phone, opened the old family group chat, and hovered over the messages. My mother's endless updates, Anna's shallow gratitude, my father's dismissive jokes, all the noise that had filled my life for years. Then, without hesitation, I hit delete conversation. The screen went blank. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like loss. It felt like peace. I went back to my desk, opened my laptop, and stared at the contracts once more. The deadlines were clear, the terms unbreakable. And in bold type, centered at the top of every page, the same name repeated like a promise: client of record. Amour Events, LLC, Claire Donovan. I closed the folder slowly, the weight of it grounding me. They think I'll keep fixing everything, I murmured to the empty room. Maybe it's time to show them what happens when I don't. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet, steady, unstoppable, just like the plan forming in my mind. The phone rang just as I was pouring my second cup of coffee. I almost didn't answer until I saw the caller ID, Whitestone Mansion. I hesitated for a moment, then picked up. "Good morning, Miss Donovan," said a warm, polished voice. "This is Mr. Hale from Whitestone Events. I'm just calling to remind you, the final balance for the Donovan Hughes wedding is due in 3 weeks, as per your contract with us." There was that phrase, again, your contract. The sound of it sank into me like a pulse. "Thank you, Mr. Hale. I'll make a note of it," I said evenly, though inside something sharp and quiet began to stir. When I hung up, I stood there in my kitchen, staring at the marble countertop. My name was on every paper. My signature sealed every deal. For the first time, I truly understood the power in those small, looping letters. I spent the rest of the morning reading through old files. The folder names were a timeline of my career: Carver wedding, Patel ceremony, Donovan Hughes. That last one felt different now, like a weapon dressed as paperwork. I ran my finger along the edge of the folder and whispered to no one, "You thought you could erase me, Anna." But I wrote my name into the foundation. By mid-afternoon, I called Gianna. Lunch was all I said. She didn't ask questions. Her office smelled faintly of espresso and ink, the walls lined with framed degrees and client photos. When I arrived, she was already flipping through a binder. "You brought them," she said, motioning to the contracts in my hand. "Every last one." She gestured toward the seat across from her desk. "Sit. Let's make sure we understand what you have." I spread out the pages while she skimmed, her eyes sharp, her pen moving quickly over notes. "This is impressive, Claire," she said finally. "You weren't kidding when you told me you protect your business." "I learned the hard way," I said quietly. First year after starting Amour Events, a client refused to pay their final invoice. I almost lost my apartment. That's when I started studying contract law at night. "You remember?" Gianna nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "You became my favorite student. And you drafted half of these clauses yourself." She tapped one paragraph with her pen. "See this, Section 7.1, automatic termination if payment isn't received by the deadline. That means if your sister doesn't pay on time, the entire wedding dissolves. Legally, cleanly." I looked up from the papers. "And the deposit's refundable to your company, which means the money flows back to you, not to her." So I said slowly, I could walk away, and no one could sue or claim breach. Gianna folded her hands. "Not if you follow procedure. You have every right to enforce these terms. You're not burning bridges, Claire. You're closing open wounds." I laughed softly. "That sounds like something a therapist would say." She shrugged. "I work with brides. I've learned that contracts and therapy overlap more than you'd think." I leaned back in my chair, letting the truth sink in. "This isn't revenge," I said. Gianna met my gaze evenly. "No, it's business." For a moment, the words hung in the air, solid and satisfying. Business. Not revenge. Not family drama. Just cause and effect. When I left her office, the sky was fading into a lavender haze over downtown Boston. The air was sharp, the kind that cut through thoughts and left only clarity behind. I walked home along the river, my heels echoing against the cobblestones, the city lights flickering like quiet witnesses. That night I poured a glass of red wine and spread the contracts across my dining table. The papers gleamed under the soft yellow light, each one a thread in a web of control I hadn't even realized I'd built. I flipped to the first page of the venue agreement: client of record, Amour Events, LLC, Claire Donovan. My own handwriting stared back at me. I worked methodically, highlighting clauses, attaching sticky notes, color-coding payment schedules. There was comfort in the rhythm, in the absolute precision of it. Numbers didn't lie, terms didn't change their mind overnight. The calm, clean language of professionalism felt like oxygen after years of emotional smog. Around 10, my phone buzzed. "Ethan." "Still working?" he asked when I answered. "Yes, I can hear the paper shuffling." "You're planning something, aren't you? I'm protecting myself." He was quiet for a beat. "Good. Just promise me you'll keep your peace. Don't let them drag you back into their chaos." I smiled. "Oh, I'm done with chaos." After we hung up, I stayed at the table, staring at the neat stacks of paper. A strange warmth filled me, not joy exactly, but something like strength. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about finally stepping into the authority I'd been too afraid to claim. At midnight, I lit a single candle and laid the signed contracts beside it. The flame flickered, gently illuminating my name printed across every page. For years, I'd let my family define me as the helper, the peacekeeper, the background noise. But here, under the soft hum of city light, I saw something else entirely, a woman who'd built her own empire, small but steady, brick by brick. I took a photo of the contracts not out of vanity but as a reminder, evidence of who I'd become. Then I opened my laptop and began drafting emails. To whom it may concern, I typed the words coming effortlessly as the contracted client for the Donovan Hughes wedding. Please note that all outstanding balances must be paid by the date specified in Section 7.1. Failure to remit payment will result in automatic cancellation per our agreement. No emotion, no drama, just precision. I copied the message into 4 drafts: venue, catering, florist, linens, and attached the relevant clauses. The cursor blinked steadily at the end of the final line. Tomorrow I would schedule them to send automatically. No confrontation, no arguments, just quiet action. By the time I shut my laptop, the candle had burned low. I picked up my engagement ring from the counter and turned it between my fingers. Ethan had given it to me last spring, a symbol of partnership and mutual respect. I placed it beside the contracts, the flame reflecting off both gold and paper. For once, I wasn't choosing between love and independence. I was standing in both. Before going to bed, I stepped out onto my balcony. The air was cold and smelled faintly of snow. Below, the Charles River shimmered under the moonlight. The world was still waiting. They thought kindness was weakness, I murmured. They never read the fine print. The next morning, sunlight streamed through my blinds and I felt lighter than I had in months. I dressed in a cream blouse, tied my hair back, and brewed coffee while the city outside came alive. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9. At exactly 9:00 a.m., I pressed send all. 4 emails left my outbox in perfect synchrony. I watched them disappear, my heart calm and steady. No adrenaline, no regret, just a deep-grounded certainty that I had done the right thing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for someone else to fix the situation. I was the one writing the rules. That night, as I sat by the window with a glass of wine, I opened my inbox once more. No replies yet. Only silence. But I knew that silence wouldn't last long. Somewhere across the city, my sister and my parents still believed I would bend, that I'd eventually come back to smooth things over as I always did. They were wrong. I closed the laptop, watching the candlelight flicker across the dark glass. The reflection of my own face stared back, calm, composed, quietly powerful. They built their fairy tale on my work, I whispered. Now I decide how it ends. Outside, the city glowed beneath a soft blanket of snow, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged in my own story. The city was still half asleep when I woke before dawn. My apartment felt unusually quiet, as if the air itself was waiting. I stood at the window wrapped in my robe, watching the thin orange glow of sunrise cut across the skyline. On my desk behind me, 4 printed contracts sat in perfect alignment. Every clause, every signature, Every legal line now felt like a shield. I didn't need to raise my voice. My words were already written in ink. I brewed a pot of coffee, the smell curling through the air like a calm ritual. When I sat down at the desk, I didn't rush. I reread each document, slowly, almost reverently. The balance due date 7 days away. My name bold, centered, permanent. The family that had treated me like a disposable assistant had unknowingly signed away the keys to their kingdom. I smiled faintly and whispered, "Let's see how they handle order without me." At 8:30, I grabbed my coat and left for downtown. The streets shimmered from last night's frost, the sidewalks slick with a thin layer of snow. Gianna's cafe was already open when I arrived, the warm scent of roasted beans and cinnamon drifting into the morning air. She waved from her usual corner table, her hair tied up, a pen already in her hand. "Good timing," she said as I slid into the chair across from her. "I was just thinking about you." "Then you must have sensed I'm about to do something radical," I said. She laughed softly. "You radical? You've always been the most polite revolutionary I've ever met." "I sent the emails yesterday," I told her, lowering my voice. "Payment reminders to every vendor. Formal, professional, cold." Gianna's eyes lit with quiet pride. "Good. Keep it that way. Emotion muddies the water. Precision wins wars." "I'm not trying to start a war." She stirred her coffee slowly. "Sometimes standing up for yourself looks like rebellion to people who are used to your compliance." Her words hung in the air between us. Outside, the city hummed, awake cars passing shop doors, opening, snowflakes melting in the pale light. I reached into my bag and handed her a folder. "I printed everything. You'll see the timeline emails and all contract copies. I just want to make sure I'm covered." Gianna flipped through the papers, quickly nodding. "Everything's airtight. If the payments aren't in by the 7th day, you're free to terminate, and they can't contest it." "What about refunds?" "They go back to Amor Events," she said simply. "To you, not them." I took a slow breath, letting it settle. Gianna leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Claire, listen to me. This isn't cruelty. You've done nothing wrong. You followed the law, you gave notice, you kept everything clean. What happens next, it's not on you." "I know," I said quietly. "For once I actually know." After we said goodbye, I walked along the frozen river, my thoughts strangely peaceful. The old Claire, the one who apologized for existing, would have called Anna, already tried to negotiate, tried to soothe. But this version of me knew better. I didn't owe them my sanity. That afternoon, back in my studio, I opened my laptop and drafted one more round of emails. Short, polite, absolute. "Dear vendor, this is a courtesy reminder of the outstanding balance for the Donovan Hughes wedding. Failure to submit payment within 7 days will result in cancellation as per the agreed terms. Sincerely, Claire Donovan, Amor Events." I reread each message twice, ensuring the tone carried no anger, no apology, just fact. Then I clicked send. When the last one disappeared from my outbox, I sat back and let the quiet fill the room. No fireworks, no drama, just the sound of calm power. That evening, as I was finishing a floral layout for another client, my phone rang. "Mom." I hesitated, watching the screen vibrate for several seconds before I answered. "Hi, Mom." Her tone was brittle. "Your sister just called me. The florist says they need confirmation from you for some final payments." "Why would they call you instead of Anna?" "Because the contracts are under my company's name," I said evenly. A pause. Then her voice sharpened. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Claire. Can't you just take care of it? She's already stressed. Be the bigger person." "I've been the bigger person for 30 years, I said quietly. "That's how we got here." "Don't be dramatic," she snapped. "This is family, not business." "Mom," I said, my patience thinning, "it became business the moment you all expected me to work for free and still be grateful." "Claire, don't do this," she said, her voice rising. "If you go through with this, I'm not doing anything," I interrupted gently. "I'm just letting the contract stand." "You'll regret this," she hissed, and then the line went dead. I set the phone down carefully. The silence that followed wasn't guilt, it was relief. For the first time in my life, I hadn't argued, justified, or softened my boundaries. I'd simply held them. That night, I sat on the couch with a glass of wine, the city lights flickering through the blinds. I thought of all the years I'd bent myself into shapes to fit their expectations. The obedient daughter, the dependable sister, the fixer of every mess. And how they'd mistaken that endurance for weakness. But strength, I realized, isn't in forgiveness or sacrifice. Sometimes strength is in the stillness of not reacting. Outside, snow began to fall again, coating the street in white. I walked to the window, pressing my hand to the cold glass. In the reflection, my face looked calm, unrecognizable even to me. I whispered softly, "They can't touch me anymore." The next morning I woke before my alarm. The sky was pale, washed in soft pink light. I brewed my coffee and waited for 9 o'clock. When the minute hand reached the top of the hour, I refreshed my inbox. One by one, the confirmation messages arrived, each vendor acknowledging receipt of my email, each system logging the countdown. 7 days until expiration. At 9:01, I smiled. Later that day, Ethan came over. He leaned against the doorframe, watching me type. "You're in your element," he said. "I'm focused," I replied. He handed me a small paper bag. Inside was a croissant and a folded note. "Breakfast and wisdom," he said. I unfolded the paper. His handwriting was messy but kind. Sometimes peace isn't about winning. It's about choosing not to fight where there's no respect left to lose. I looked up at him. "You wrote that." He shrugged. "Stole it from a podcast, probably. But it fits you." I laughed quietly. "It does." That night I didn't dream of confrontation or chaos. I dreamed of a quiet river flowing endlessly forward, smooth and unstoppable. The next few days passed like the eye of a storm. No one called. No one texted. I went to work, met clients, smiled genuinely for the first time in months. My studio thrived under the rhythm of efficiency and purpose. Each day that passed, the deadline crept closer, and my anxiety faded instead of growing. On the 7th night, I walked along the Charles River again. The air was crisp, the moon reflected perfectly on the water's surface. I stopped halfway across the bridge, taking in the lights of the city. My city. Every decision, every scar, every boundary had brought me here. I closed my eyes and whispered into the winter air. Tomorrow, everything changes. When I got home, I checked my laptop one last time. The timer I'd set on my screen glowed softly. Final payment due, 7 hours 12 minutes. I turned off the light and went to bed. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. My alarm wasn't needed. The world outside was painted in silver and quiet. I poured coffee, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the automatic emails triggered. One by one, they sent themselves, perfectly timed, impeccably worded, irrevocable. I took a slow sip of coffee and whispered, "Let the countdown begin." Outside, the city moved as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Somewhere across town, my family still believed I'd cave, that I'd show up like I always did to clean their chaos. They didn't know that the contracts they'd signed had just begun to close around them. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. The alarm went off at 7, but I was already awake. I'd spent most of the night half dreaming, half thinking, floating somewhere between calm and anticipation. When I finally sat up, the first thing I saw was my laptop, its screen still glowing faintly, the timer blinking. 6 days, 23 hours, 59 minutes. The countdown had begun. The coffee machine hummed softly in the kitchen as the city outside yawned into motion. Boston mornings in winter always had this strange, beauty, brutal cold wrapped in golden light. I sipped from my mug and stared out the window at the skyline. Somewhere across town, my sister was probably obsessing over wedding decorations, blissfully unaware that her perfect day was unraveling 1 hour at a time. The phone buzzed again and again, notifications piling in from vendors and automated reminders. I didn't open them immediately. I didn't need to. Everything was running like clockwork, and I was the one who set it. When I finally checked, every message was a confirmation of what I already knew: no payments had come in. Not a single one. I felt a wave of serenity, not triumph, just stillness. For years I'd lived in their chaos, but now I was the one holding the tempo. Around noon, Ethan stopped by with lunch. He found me cross-legged on the couch, laptop open, to-do lists sprawled around me. "You're too calm," he said, setting down a bag of sandwiches. "It's unnerving." "I think I'm just finally aligned," I replied. "Aligned," he repeated, smiling. "That's one word for it." He sat beside me and handed me a coffee. "You realize this is the first time I've seen you in control of your life, and not apologizing for it." I smiled faintly. "It feels strange. Like I stole something that was always mine." He studied me quietly for a moment. "You know we could be anywhere right now. Paris, Florence, Amalfi. You don't have to stay here and watch this unfold." "I'm not watching," I said. "I'm walking away. There's a difference." He reached into his jacket and pulled out 2 printed flight itineraries, sliding them across the table toward me. "What's this?" "Our tickets. Italy. 10 days. We leave next Friday." I glanced down at the dates, my chest tightening slightly. "That's the day of the wedding." "I know," he said, his tone gentle but deliberate. "Seems poetic, doesn't it? You boarding a plane while they scramble to save a wedding you built." I couldn't help laughing. "You have a dramatic streak. Maybe. Or maybe I just want to see you free." I looked down at the tickets again. Rome, Florence, Venice. The idea of being oceans away while my family's world imploded was both terrifying and liberating. "Book it," I said finally. He smiled. "Already did." That evening I walked to the river again. The snow had melted into slick patches of ice, reflecting the lights of the bridges overhead. I leaned on the railing and watched the water move beneath me. The clock on my phone read 5 days, 14 hours. It was strange how something as small as a clause in a contract could shift the entire power dynamic of a family. By the next morning, the first wave of chaos had begun. I was in the middle of a client meeting when my phone started buzzing nonstop. I silenced it, pretending not to notice, but the calls kept stacking: Mom, Dad, even an unfamiliar number I recognized from the venue. I ignored them all. After the meeting, I stepped outside into the cold, pulling my coat tighter around me. I listened to one voicemail out of curiosity. It was my mother, her tone sharp with panic. "Claire, this is ridiculous. Mr. Hale from Whitestone just called me. He said there's been a payment issue. Can you please handle this? Your sister is too busy to deal with your paperwork. Don't let pride ruin her big day." I ended the message and scrolled to the next one. My father's voice, angry, commanding. "You're not going to humiliate this family over a stupid contract. Make the payments or fix this before it becomes a disaster." Then, Anna's voice, shrill, breathless. "What did you do?" "The caterer said the balance is unpaid. You said you'd handle it, Claire. This isn't funny." I stood there on the street, the cold wind biting my cheeks, and laughed, not from joy but from disbelief. Even now they didn't understand. They thought I was the problem to be managed, not the one holding all the strings. That night I poured myself a glass of wine and listened to the voicemails again, just to remind myself how far I'd come. There was a time those voices could have shattered me. Not anymore. 2 days later, the calls turned into pleading. My mother's tone softened into guilt. "Sweetheart, don't do this. Your sister's been crying all day. She's exhausted. She doesn't deserve this." I almost pitied her then. Almost. But guilt had lost its power over me. I pressed delete. On Wednesday night, Ethan cooked dinner for us at his apartment. As we ate by candlelight, he asked, "How do you feel?" "Like I'm watching a movie," I said. "Except this time I'm not in the scene." He grinned. "Good. Stay out of it." After dinner, he poured wine and handed me my passport. "Keep it close. We're leaving in 48 hours. The next morning, my father called again. I let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice was clipped, angry, desperate. "This isn't just about Anna Claire. This is about family. You're going to regret this. You're tearing everything apart because you can't let go of your ego." I shook my head. Ego, that was their word for boundaries. By Thursday night, I had packed my suitcase. Every item I folded felt symbolic: one dress for the trip, one life left behind. My travel documents sat on the dresser beside my engagement ring, and the folder marked "Contracts Closed." I made myself tea, sat by the window, and wrote in my journal, "Day 7, no guilt, no apologies, just consequence." Friday morning came quietly. Pale light filled my apartment, soft and forgiving. The city outside looked almost unreal, coated in frost and silence. I dressed in a simple cream coat and boots, my suitcase waiting by the door. At exactly 9 o'clock, the notifications began. One after another, the automated system sent me updates: payment not received, contract void, event cancelled, deposit refunded to account. I didn't move. I just watched them appear on my screen, each one a quiet echo of justice. At 9:01, my phone started ringing. Mom, then Anna, then Dad, then the venue. I didn't answer a single one. Instead, I turned off my phone, slipped it into my bag, and took a deep breath. The weight that had lived on my chest for years lifted in an instant. I was done. Ethan arrived minutes later, suitcase in hand. Ready more than I've ever been. We called a cab and rode to Logan Airport in silence. The city passed by in blurred streaks of gray and gold, the streets wet from melting snow. As the car pulled onto the highway, I glanced at the clock on the dashboard: 9:47. The wedding was in less than 24 hours. "Think they've noticed yet?" Ethan asked almost playfully. "They will," I said. "They always do, just too late." He smiled. "That's your karma, Claire. Timing." When we reached the airport, I looked back once through the cab window at the skyline fading behind us. For a moment, I felt a flicker of sadness. Not for them, but for the years I'd wasted trying to earn what should have been given freely. At the gate, I turned my phone back on one last time. Dozens of missed calls lit the screen: Mom, Dad, Anna, unknown numbers. 97 messages. I didn't open a single one. I powered the phone off and placed it face down beside my boarding pass. When the flight attendant called for boarding, I stood up, rolled my suitcase behind me, and smiled at Ethan. "Let's go." As we walked down the jet bridge, I felt lighter than I had in my entire life. While they scrambled to salvage the wedding I'd built, I was already leaving the country. Justice, I thought, didn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it looked like boarding a plane in silence while the world you left behind finally learned how to collapse without you. The morning light slipped through the hotel curtains, soft and gold, brushing across my suitcase like a whisper. I could hear the faint hum of the city waking outside, the muted roll of traffic, the sound of distant church bells, but inside my room everything felt still. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, watching the clock tick toward 9. The emails were already queued, 4 of them. Polite, final, irreversible. The cursor blinked on my screen, waiting for one last confirmation. I took a slow breath and pressed send all. 9 o'clock sharp. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was so complete that I could hear the soft hiss of the radiator. Then one by one, the confirmation pings arrived: sent, delivered, processed. The wheels were in motion. Somewhere across Boston, my family's perfect day was unraveling thread by thread. I stood pulling back the curtains. Outside, the snow had melted into rain overnight, the streets glistening beneath the rising Sunday. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't nervous. There was no rush of adrenaline or guilt, just a quiet, steady calm, the kind that only comes when you finally stop apologizing for protecting yourself. By 9:15, the phone began to vibrate. Mom first, then Anna, then the venue number I recognized: Whitestone Mansion. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and turned up the volume on the news, just loud enough to drown out the buzzing. When Ethan came out of the shower, towel slung low around his hips, he raised an eyebrow. "They're calling already. They'll be calling all day." I said, sipping my coffee. I'm not answering. He smiled faintly, drying his hair. You're calm. I'm done, I corrected. We left for the airport 30 minutes later. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of rain and jet fuel as the cab pulled away from the curb. I rolled the window down just enough to feel the cold. You know, I said quietly, for years I thought if I ever stood up to them it would feel violent, like setting something on fire. And does it? Ethan asked. No, I said, watching the skyline fade behind us. It feels like exhaling. Meanwhile, across the city, the storm I'd created was beginning. At Whitestone Mansion, the staff was setting up for the Donovan Hughes wedding, placing champagne flutes on polished tables, arranging white roses in tall glass vases. The morning light spilled through the stained glass windows, touching everything with an almost holy glow. Anna was upstairs in the bridal suite, robe wrapped around her, laughing with her bridesmaids as the makeup artist blended foundation across her skin. For once, she looked genuinely happy. Then the door burst open. Miss Donovan, said Mr. Hale, the event manager, his voice strained but polite. We have a situation. Anna blinked at him through the mirror. Can this wait? I'm about to start hair. I'm afraid not. What is it? She asked, irritation flaring. The final balance was never received, he said carefully. We sent reminders. The contract is in your sister's company name. Without payment, the event cannot proceed. Laughter rippled through the room. Anna smirked, waving a manicured hand. You're mistaken. Claire's my sister, not my wedding planner anymore. The payments were supposed to go through Dad's account. I understand, Mr. Hale said, maintaining professional composure. But legally the contract is with Amor Events. It has been voided as of this morning. Anna's face drained of color. Void? What do you mean, void? I mean the booking was cancelled, Miss Donovan. We're releasing the space for other clients. I'm terribly sorry. Downstairs staff had already begun clearing floral arrangements following company policy. The string quartet was packing up their instruments. Catering vans idled outside, waiting for new instructions. Within an hour, the wedding of the year had dissolved into confusion. Back in the suite, chaos erupted. Anna's mother, my mother, stormed in, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. What's happening? Why are they moving the flowers? Anna spun toward her, wild-eyed. Claire canceled everything. She's trying to ruin me. Mom's face flushed crimson. That's absurd. She wouldn't. She couldn't. She did, Anna screamed. She planned this whole thing under her business. It's her company. Her contracts. Don't you get it? She owns the wedding downstairs. Dylan, the groom, had arrived early to greet guests. He was halfway through adjusting his tie when Antonio from the catering team approached him nervously. Mr. Hughes, I'm sorry, but without final payment we cannot deliver the meals. Our trucks are being redirected. What are you talking about? Dylan said, eyes narrowing. I'm afraid Amor Events canceled the order. By 11, the mansion was in total chaos. Guests began arriving to find half-decorated tables, no music, no food. Staff whispered in corners, trying to contact their managers. Anna was crying, mascara streaking down her cheeks, while my parents shouted into their phones, demanding explanations that no one could give. At one point, Dylan cornered Anna outside the bridal suite. His voice was low, but the anger in it was unmistakable. You told me your sister was just helping with the logistics. You said she had no control. She was supposed to. Anna sobbed. She's just doing this to get back at me. Dylan stared at her, disbelief and disgust flickering across his face. Get back at you for what? For planning your wedding for free. She froze. Maybe, he said quietly, you deserve this. Back at Logan Airport, I was sitting in the first-class lounge with Ethan sipping espresso. Through the wide windows, I watched planes taxi across the tarmac, their wings cutting through the fog. My phone lay beside my boarding pass screen, lighting up every few seconds, calls, voicemails, texts. Are you going to check them? Ethan asked. No, not even one. I shook my head. If I open them, I'm letting them back in. I've done enough of that for one lifetime. He smiled and reached for my hand. So what now? I said. We fly to Italy. When our flight was called, I turned my phone face down and walked toward the gate. As I handed my ticket to the attendant, I felt a strange lightness, like stepping into a new life, wearing the skin of someone braver. The plane lifted off 30 minutes later. I watched as the city shrank below the harbor, shining like liquid glass. I knew somewhere down there the chaos was still unfolding. My parents calling lawyers, Anna sobbing into her ruined bouquet, guests whispering about the canceled ceremony. But none of that noise could reach me now. Midway through the flight, I finally opened my laptop to check my business account. 4 deposits had appeared, refunds from the canceled contracts. The total read $18,642. Clean, legal, mine. I exhaled slowly and closed the screen. Ethan glanced at me. "What was that look, Balance?" I said simply. He chuckled. "Literal or emotional, both." The rest of the flight passed in peace. I read a novel I'd been meaning to finish for months, watched the clouds drift like mountains below, and slept for the first time in days. When we landed in Rome, sunlight poured through the airport windows like molten gold. The air smelled of espresso and possibility. As we waited for our luggage, I turned on my phone for the first time since takeoff. 47 missed calls, 23 voicemails, 89 text messages. I didn't open a single one. Instead, I opened my camera and took a picture of the sunrise spilling across the runway. Later, as the cab wound through the streets of Rome, I leaned my head on Ethan's shoulder. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" I asked quietly. "Maybe," he said, "but it's not your job to make them." We arrived at the hotel just as the bells of St. Peter's began to ring. I stood at the window watching them swing against the blue sky. Down below, the city moved on, vendors opening stalls, children laughing, the world carrying on like it always does after a storm. For the first time, I understood what peace really was. Not silence, not justice, just the decision to stop fighting for a place in someone else's story. I turned to Ethan and smiled. "I'm ready for dinner," he grinned. "Finally, something we can both agree on." As we stepped out into the glowing evening, the sound of the bells faded behind us, replaced by the soft rhythm of footsteps on cobblestone and the promise of a new beginning. The plane dipped low over the Venetian lagoon, the water below glittering like shattered glass. I pressed my forehead to the window, watching the maze of canals and rooftops unfold beneath us, golden under the late afternoon Sunday. For the first time in months, my heart felt still. The chaos I'd left behind in Boston, the calls, the anger, the accusations had faded somewhere over the Atlantic. All that was left was this moment suspended between endings and beginnings. Ethan reached across the aisle, his fingers brushing mine. "You look like you're finally breathing again," he said. "I think I am," I whispered. When we stepped off the plane, the air felt different, softer, scented with sea salt and history. A driver held a sign for us, and minutes later we were gliding across the water in a wooden boat, the city rising around us like a dream. Venice wasn't loud. It breathed. Bells rang in the distance, mingling with the sound of oars slicing through the canal. The skyline shimmered, the marble buildings glowing with the last light of day. Our hotel was an old palazzo near the Grand Canal, restored into a small luxury retreat. From the window of our suite, I could see gondolas drifting past, their ripples catching the reflection of the moon. Ethan unpacked quietly while I stood by the window, mesmerized by the stillness. "Feels like another world," he said behind me. "It is," I replied. "And maybe that's exactly what I needed." Later that evening, we walked hand in hand along narrow streets, the cobblestones slick with mist. The city smelled of brine and espresso, old stone and candle wax. In a small restaurant tucked between 2 bridges, we ordered pasta and red wine, the kind of meal that lingered long after the plates were cleared. Ethan talked about his plans for Florence, for his company's expansion, but I only half listened. My mind was drifting, not backward, not forward, just free. When we returned to the hotel, I stood on the balcony, overlooking the canal. A gondolier sang somewhere below, his voice echoing softly off the water. I closed my eyes, letting the melody wash over me. For so long, my life had been about fixing, pleasing, surviving. Now, for the first time, it was about being. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, turning the room gold. I woke before Ethan and made coffee, the sound of the mocha pot bubbling quietly in the kitchenette. I carried the cup to the window and sat cross-legged on the sill. Below, Venice was already alive, church bells ringing, shopkeepers setting out flowers, a woman feeding pigeons in the square. I opened my journal and began to write. Day 3. The silence doesn't hurt anymore. Maybe it never did. Maybe I was just afraid to hear what peace sounded like. By the time Ethan stirred, I had filled 2 pages. He yawned and leaned against the doorway. Working on your novel again? Just my story, I said, smiling. Finally on my terms. We spent the next few days exploring. The Rialto Bridge gleamed under the morning sun. Street Mark's Basilica shimmered with mosaics that looked like fire captured in stone. On Murano Island, we watched glassblowers shape molten color into delicate forms. In Burano, we ate seafood risotto by the canal, surrounded by houses painted in shades of lemon, coral, and mint. Everywhere we went, the city whispered, "Stay." And for the first time, I listened. One afternoon, as the light softened over the lagoon, I sat by the window of a small cafe and opened my laptop. The cursor blinked on a blank document. Without thinking, I began to type. The truth about family loyalty: sometimes love looks like silence, and sometimes silence looks like freedom. I wrote for 3 hours straight. The words poured out of me, every wound, every betrayal, every lesson. I didn't write with bitterness. I wrote with clarity. By the time I stopped, my coffee had gone cold, and the waiter had refilled my water twice. When I looked at the page, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not revenge, but release. That night, I showed Ethan what I'd written. It's honest, he said after reading the first few paragraphs. Raw, but kind. Kind, I asked. I wasn't aiming for kind. It's what makes it powerful, he said. You're not writing to punish them. You're writing to set yourself free. I leaned my head against his shoulder. Do you think anyone will understand? Every person who's ever been taken for granted will. We decided to post it on my blog, the one I used for my business, where I usually wrote about wedding trends and event design. I hesitated before hitting publish, but something inside me said, let it go. Within 24 hours, the post spread faster than I ever could have imagined. Comments poured in from strangers across the world, women planners, daughters, siblings, all telling their own stories of betrayal, boundaries, and rebirth. The headline began appearing on wedding forums, lifestyle blogs, even a few small news outlets. When I checked my inbox the next morning, it was overflowing. Not just messages of support, but inquiries. Clients wanted to work with me not because of sympathy, but respect. They saw me as someone who knew her worth. Claire, Ethan said that evening, reading over my shoulder, you realize you've gone viral, right? I laughed softly. I guess truth travels fast. Back home in Boston, they must have seen it too. I imagined my mother reading the article, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the comments. I imagined Anna seeing the flood of support from strangers, realizing for the first time how deeply her actions had cut. But I didn't feel cruel satisfaction, just distance. The kind that comes when you've finally outgrown the pain that once shaped you. The next morning, we took a train to Florence. The landscape rolled by in shades of gold and green vineyards, villages, and cypress trees that stood like watchmen on the hills. I rested my head against the window, watching the world blur by. Thinking about them, Ethan asked quietly. Not really, I said. More about me, about who I'm becoming. He smiled. That's the best kind of thinking. In Florence, we stayed in a small apartment overlooking the Arno. Every morning, the smell of fresh bread drifted up from the bakery below. I filled my days with color sketching, journaling, wandering through galleries, until I lost track of time. I let beauty rewire my heart. On the 6th night, as the sun sank behind the Ponte Vecchio, Ethan took my hand. Claire, he said softly, you realize this is the happiest I've ever seen you. I looked out at the water, its surface glowing with gold. "It's the happiest I've ever felt," I said, "because for once my peace doesn't depend on anyone else." He kissed me, then slow and certain, the city lights flickering like fireflies around us. Later, I returned to my journal. Day 10, I don't miss the noise. I don't miss the pretending. I just miss the version of myself that used to believe I had to earn love. She was wrong. Love shouldn't cost your peace. As I wrote, I thought about how far I'd come from the girl desperate for family approval to the woman who now defined her own worth. I looked out the window one last time before bed. The bells of Florence chimed softly in the distance, echoing through the narrow streets. Somewhere far away, the ghosts of my old life were still talking, still blaming, still trying to make sense of a story I'd already finished. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was here in Italy, in peace in myself. The bells of street marks echoed through the Venetian air, when I woke soft and distant like a dream refusing to let go. The city shimmered outside my window, pale gold light spilling across the canal. Ethan was still asleep beside me, his arm draped over the sheets, peaceful, in a way that made me wonder how long it had been since I'd felt this kind of calm. For the first time in months, I hadn't dreamed of arguments, guilt, or unfinished conversations. Only water, only peace. I slipped out of bed and stood by the open balcony. The air was cool, scented with salt and espresso from the cafe below. A gondolier hummed a tune as he drifted past, the sound dissolving into the morning. I made coffee in the small press, poured it into a porcelain cup, and watched the steam rise like a slow exhale. Somewhere across the ocean, my family was still dealing with the ruins of a wedding that never happened. But here, time had stopped caring about them. The phone on the dresser buzzed. I hesitated before walking toward it, my stomach tightening even though I already knew who it was. Missed calls, messages, voicemails, all from home. I hadn't listened to a single one since we landed. For 3 days, I'd let the notifications pile up like snowdrifts. But something in me wanted to know now, not out of guilt but curiosity. I pressed play. Mom's voice filled the room, trembling, frantic. "Claire, please call us back. The wedding's off. Everything's a disaster. Your sister's devastated. You've made your point. Just fix it, please." I closed my eyes. That word again, fix. It was always my job to repair what they broke. Not anymore. The next message was Dad, cold, angry. "You've gone too far. This is family, not business. You're destroying your sister's life over a technicality. You'd better make this right before everyone finds out what you've done." Then Anna's voice, hoarse, desperate. "Claire, please. Dylan's family is furious. They spent thousands. I don't know what to do. You have to help me. You're the only one who knows how to fix this." I almost laughed. The irony stung like perfume on a fresh wound. The one they'd exiled was now their only hope. I scrolled to the most recent voicemail left just a few hours ago. I didn't expect what I heard. Anna's voice was quieter, this time broken. Dylan called off the engagement. He said he can't marry someone who'd treat her own sister like a stranger. He told me if I could be that cruel to you, I'd eventually destroy him too. There was a pause, then, a shaky breath. "He's gone, Claire. Everything's gone." I sat down on the edge of the bed. For a long moment, I just stared at the phone in my hand, feeling the strange weight of it. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just breathed. It wasn't triumph, I felt it was stillness. This was what truth looked like when it finally caught up. Ethan stirred and looked over. "Bad news, Balance," I said softly. He frowned sleepily. "What kind of balance?" "The kind you don't have to calculate," I said, placing the phone face down. "The kind life just evens out on its own." We spent the morning walking through Venice. The narrow alleys smelled of sea salt and warm bread. Everywhere we went there was music, an accordion near a bridge, a violin echoing through a piazza. Tourists moved around us like slow waves, their laughter bouncing off the stone. I felt small but safe, invisible in the best way. As we crossed the Rialto Bridge, Ethan bought me a red silk scarf from a vendor. For victory, he said with a grin. This isn't victory, I replied, wrapping it around my neck. It's release. He smiled. Same difference. That night, I sat by the hotel window while Ethan slept. The city glowed outside, reflections of light rippling across the canal. I opened my journal, the same one I'd carried since Boston, and wrote slowly, Day 10, justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. I stared at the words, then added another line beneath. They wanted me to feel guilty for not saving them. But I've finally learned the difference between love and rescue. I closed the journal and watched the moon rise higher, feeling something inside me settle into place. The next day, I woke before dawn and walked a street, Mark's Square, alone. The streets were empty, the city still half asleep. Pigeons gathered at the fountain, the sound of water echoing softly. I ordered espresso from a small cafe and sat watching the light shift from gray to gold. For years I had measured my worth by what I could give my time, my talent, my silence. But sitting there surrounded by centuries-old stone and strangers who didn't know my name, I realized I didn't owe anyone anything anymore. The world was still turning, indifferent and beautiful. When I returned to the hotel, Ethan was packing. Train leaves in an hour, he said. Next, stop Florence. On the ride there, the countryside rolled past in fields of green and gold, dotted with farmhouses and cypress trees. I rested my head against the window, letting the rhythm of the tracks lull me into thought. I'd imagined what this kind of freedom might feel like, but it was softer than I expected. Not the high of revenge, but the calm of acceptance. Halfway to Florence, my phone buzzed again. I almost ignored it, but the name on the screen caught my eye. Gianna. Claire, she said when I answered, I just wanted to tell you I got a call from Antonio the caterer. Word's out about what happened. They're saying your family tried to pin the blame on you, but every vendor knows the truth. People are impressed, actually. You handled it perfectly. I let out a small laugh. Perfect isn't the word I'd use. Well, she said, let's call it poetic. After we hung up, I stared out the window again. Villages blurred past in soft colors, sunlight dancing on the horizon. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself. Not to Gianna, not to my parents, not even to Anna. By the time we reached Florence, the city was drenched in afternoon light. The air smelled of leather and rain. We checked into a small guest house near the Arno River, its walls covered in ivy. As the sun began to set, Ethan opened a bottle of wine on the terrace. To closure, he said, raising his glass. I smiled. To freedom. We clinked glasses, and for the first time the toast didn't feel symbolic. It felt real. Later, as we walked along the river, I thought about Anna again, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. Maybe she would learn. Maybe she wouldn't. But either way, her life was no longer my problem to solve. When we got back to the hotel, I opened my laptop to check my business email. Dozens of new inquiries filled my inbox, clients who'd read my story after my blog post went viral. Real clients who respected boundaries, who valued professionalism. The irony was almost painful. My downfall had become my greatest advertisement. I typed a quick response to one inquiry and then closed the computer. Ethan came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. You know, he said softly, you didn't just walk away from them. You built something better in the process. I turned to face him. Maybe that's what healing really is, I said. Not getting even. Just getting whole. He kissed my forehead. Then you're there. I smiled. Almost. That night, as I drifted to sleep, I thought about the sound of the ocean beyond the city, about the way the moonlight moved across the water. Back home, there would still be chaos, apologies, blame, denial. But it was no longer my storm to weather. I dreamed of silence, of bridges, of beginnings. 3 months later, the plane descended over Boston, its wings slicing through a sky washed pale with winter light. Snow dusted the rooftops below the river, winding like silver thread through the city I once called home. As the tires touched the runway, I felt that familiar twist in my stomach. Not fear exactly, but awareness. The kind that comes when you're about to face ghosts you thought you'd buried. Ethan squeezed my hand. You okay? I'm fine, I said, watching the skyline rise into view. It's strange being back. Feels like visiting a past life. He smiled softly. That's because it is. We gathered our bags in silence, and as we walked through the terminal, I realized how different it felt this time. I wasn't coming home as the forgotten daughter, the quiet fixer, or the shadow behind someone else's spotlight. I was returning as someone who had survived the fire and built something out of the ashes. Outside, the air hit cold and clean. I pulled my coat tighter and looked around the same streets, the same skyline, and yet it all looked smaller now, somehow less threatening. Like the city had stayed the same, but I'd outgrown it. By the time we reached my apartment, I could already feel the new rhythm of my life waiting for me. The sign for Amor events gleamed freshly polished above the office door. Inside, my two new assistants were arranging floral samples, their laughter echoing through the bright space. A whiteboard on the wall was filled with client names, color-coded and organized proof of everything I'd rebuilt since Italy. Welcome back, boss, one of them said, handing me a coffee. Thank you, Lena, I replied, smiling. You kept everything perfect, she grinned. We had good training. Ethan placed his suitcase by the wall and whistled. You've built a small empire while we were gone. I looked around. No, I said. I've just built it without apology. That afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the tall windows, I sat at my desk reviewing the latest contracts. Every bride I worked with now paid my full rate, no exceptions. No guilt, no family discounts, and for once, no one questioned it. I had learned to value my worth, and somehow the world had followed suit. Then I saw it. An envelope sitting neatly on my desk, no return address. Just my name written in handwriting I knew too well. My mother's. For a long moment I stared at it. The familiar ache in my chest pulsed faintly, but it didn't drown me like it once did. I slid a finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a simple note. Your sister's living with us. She's not doing well. She wants to talk. Please consider it. Love, Mom. No accusations this time. No guilt. Just words that felt human. I read it twice, then folded it back neatly. Ethan watched me from across the room. You're not going to call her, are you? Not yet, I said. Maybe not ever. I don't know. Do you want me to stay? I shook my head. No. This is something I need to sit with alone. When he left, the silence that filled the room wasn't heavy anymore. It was the kind of silence that feels earned, like calm after a long storm. That evening, I lit a candle by the window and opened my journal, the one I'd started in Venice. Day 90, I wrote. Coming home doesn't mean going backward. I thought about my mother's words about Anna hiding in her old bedroom like a child caught in her own web. Maybe one day I'd be ready to see her. Maybe not. Forgiveness wasn't a single moment. It was a slow unraveling, a decision you made every day to stop carrying what wasn't yours anymore. The next morning, I met with a client, a young surgeon named Amanda, who was planning a winter wedding at the art museum. She was everything my sister wasn't: professional, kind, respectful. She looked at me like she trusted my expertise completely, not as a favor, but as a professional worth every dollar she paid. Your work is beautiful, Amanda said as we reviewed floral mock-ups. You seem to really understand people. I smiled faintly. I understand boundaries, I said. That's close enough. When she left, I stood by the window watching snow fall over the river. A part of me still couldn't believe how much could change in a year, how the woman who used to chase validation was now the one quietly writing her own terms. That night, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, my mother stood there. Her face looked older, softer somehow. The lines around her eyes had deepened, but her expression wasn't sharp anymore. She held a small paper bag, steam rising from the top. I brought dinner, she said quietly. Your favorite soup. For a long second, I didn't move. Then I stepped aside and let her in. She placed the bag on the counter, taking in the apartment, the framed photos, the candles, the plants. "You've made a beautiful life here," she said softly. "I had to," I replied. "No one else was going to build it for me." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "You're right. We failed you, Claire." The words caught me off guard. I'd imagined this moment 100 times, but hearing it still hit something deep. She went on. "Your sister, she's different now. Broken maybe, but trying. She reads your blog every day. I think she finally understands what she did." I crossed my arms. "Understanding doesn't erase it." "No," she said, "but it's a start." We sat down at the table, the quiet stretching between us. For once, I didn't rush to fill it. My mother's eyes searched mine. "Can we start over?" she asked softly. I took a long breath. "We can start from honesty," I said. "But I'm not going back to being the family's safety net." Her lips trembled into a smile. "Fair enough." We ate in silence for a while. The soup was still warm, the flavor familiar, comforting, and painful at once. When she finally left, she hugged me longer than she ever had before. After the door closed, I stood in the quiet for a moment, the echo of her words still hanging in the air. I didn't feel angry, just resolved. Later that week, I hosted Amanda's wedding. It was flawless, elegant white orchids, crystal chandeliers, the soft sound of a live quartet filling the room. When the bride took her first dance under the gold-lit ceiling, something inside me loosened. This was what I'd always wanted to create, beauty born from balance, not chaos. As I packed up afterward, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared. "It's Anna. I know I don't deserve it, but can we meet?" I stared at it for a long time, then locked the screen. I didn't delete it this time. I just let it sit there, unanswered, a seed waiting for its season. Standing by the window, the snow still falling, I whispered to myself, "Peace isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing what's worth remembering." Outside, the city glowed softly under a blanket of white. The lights reflected in the water like tiny stars, and for the first time, I didn't feel small beneath them. I felt infinite. I picked up my journal again and wrote one last line. "Before bed, I can love them without letting them hurt me. That's my closure." Then I closed the book and blew out the candle. The first snow of March had turned to rain by the time I decided to meet her. The sky hung low and silver over Boston, the kind of day that blurred the line between winter and spring. I watched droplets streak down my office window, distorting the reflection of the city below. My calendar was full, my team buzzing with energy, but my mind was elsewhere, fixed on one simple message that had waited patiently in my phone for days. "It's Anna. I know I don't deserve it, but can we meet?" I'd read it at least a dozen times, each word tugging at something I thought I'd buried. For weeks I'd told myself silence was strength, that leaving the message unanswered meant peace. But lately that peace felt more like unfinished business. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't a gift for them, it was release for me. By noon I'd made up my mind. I texted her back, "Tomorrow, noon. Cafe on Arlington Street." The next day the city was quiet after the rain, its streets glistening under a pale Sunday. I arrived first, choosing a corner table by the window. The cafe smelled like fresh pastries and roasted espresso, warm and familiar. My heart thudded once sharply when the door opened. Anna stood there hesitant, her eyes searching the room until they found me. She looked smaller than I remembered. The polished confidence she once wore like perfume was gone. Her coat was simple, her hair pulled back, her face pale beneath the faint traces of makeup. When she sat down, her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "You look different," she said quietly. "I am," I replied. There was a long pause. Outside, people hurried past with umbrellas, their reflections flickering in the puddles. Inside, time felt suspended. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. "I almost didn't." She nodded, eyes fixed on the table. "I've replayed everything you know. The texts, the calls, what I said to you. It's like watching someone else ruin her own life in slow motion." I said nothing. She looked up, her voice trembling. You have every right to hate me. I don't, I said softly. I just stopped trying to make sense of you. Her lips quivered. I was jealous, she whispered. You made everything look so easy, your business, your calm, your independence, and instead of learning from you, I punished you for it. I thought if I tore you down, I'd feel taller. I let the words hang there heavy but honest. For years I'd waited for an apology like this. I used to dream about it. But now that it was here, I realized I didn't need it to move on. I'd already done that without her. I'm sorry, Claire, she said, tears filling her eyes. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just needed you to know that I see it now. Everything. What I did. What we did. Her voice broke and she reached into her bag, pulling out an envelope. She slid it across the table. It's a check. I know it's not enough, but it's everything I have. I need to pay back what I owe you. I looked at it but didn't touch it. You can keep it, I said. She blinked in confusion. What I don't need your money, Anna. What I needed was respect. And I finally have that from myself. Her chin trembled. Then what do? I leaned back, watching her closely. You start again? Not for me, not for Mom or Dad. For yourself. Stop performing goodness. Start living it. Her tears fell freely now, but her expression softened. You've changed, she said. I had to, I replied. You don't survive a family like ours by staying the same. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that wasn't hostile but full of something quieter, acceptance maybe. When I finally stood, I rested a hand gently on her shoulder. You have to build your own peace now, I said. The way I built mine. As I stepped outside, a soft wind brushed my face. The sky had cleared to a pale blue and the air smelled faintly of earth and thawing snow. The city was waking up again. I walked toward the public garden, the same place I'd gone months ago when everything fell apart. The pond was half frozen, but the ducks were back, gliding across the patches of water that had melted. I sat on a bench, sipping my coffee, and let the stillness settle around me. I thought of all the moments that had brought me here, the text that shattered me, the contracts. I'd weaponized the silence that became my power, the plane lifting off as my family's world collapsed. I thought of Venice and Florence and the journal entries I'd written in candlelight, and then finally of my mother's weary eyes when she said, "Your sister's trying." Maybe that was enough. Ethan found me there an hour later, his coat dusted with snow. I figured I'd find you here, he said, handing me a warm drink. How'd it go? It went, I said, smiling faintly. He sat beside me. You forgive her, I nodded slowly. I think I already had. I just needed to hear myself say it. He smiled, brushing his thumb against my hand. You did it, Claire. You closed the circle. I shook my head. No, I said quietly. I just stopped fighting the wrong battles. We sat there watching the last of the snowflakes fall, the afternoon sun spilling through the trees. Across the park, children laughed, their boots splashing in puddles. Somewhere, someone played a soft tune on a violin. Life had gone on without my permission, and I was finally ready to join it. Later that evening, I stood by the window of my apartment, the city lights glittering below. My reflection looked back at me, not the woman who'd once been invisible, but someone solid, present, whole. I opened my journal one last time and wrote, Day 120, I can love them without letting them hurt me. That's my closure. I closed the book and exhaled. The kind of breath that feels like release. In the end, I didn't need to rewrite the past. I just needed to stop letting it write me. And maybe that's the truth for anyone who's ever been broken by family, by betrayal, by silence, by love that came with conditions. You can't always fix what they destroyed, but you can stop them from destroying you. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about saying, I forgive you. It's about waking up one day and realizing that what they did no longer defines who you are. If you've ever had to choose yourself over people who kept taking your kindness for granted, I'd love to hear your story. Tell me in the comments below. Maybe someone out there needs to know they're not alone. And if this story stayed with you, stay a while. There are more voices, more stories, and more justice waiting here. Because sometimes healing begins the moment we tell the truth and decide to keep living anyway.